Hope you guys enjoyed the thumbnail that I put together for this show because I was very excited about it. I got to put a little collage of all my favorite Gothic things. Good evening, everyone. I'm your host, Jason Miles, on another episode of This is Revolution podcast. If you are new to the channel, welcome. So glad to have you here. If you like what we're doing, please hit like and subscribe. It is a passive gesture that goes a very long way. If you are a returning listener, subscriber, or one of our very valued patrons, right. So glad that you guys are back. Quick reminder, this is a listener-funded program here on TIR, and we appreciate your viewership and support. For without y'all, we couldn't do this. Just a reminder that because of the uncensored nature of this show, we often get demonetized. So if you have the means and feel so inclined, consider becoming a patron. For just $3 a month or $30 for the year, you can access champagne rooms, our patron-only call-in shows. You get discounts on live events like our show in San Francisco next week. I'm so excited. Next week. And the majority of the band said they're showing up. The other black guy hasn't responded to the group text. You would think the other black guy in the band would be like, of course I'll be there. That being said, you can hang out with me and Ben. I'm excited to see some Bay Area people I haven't seen in forever. It's going to be a good time. It's going to be a very, very, very good time. All that being said, after the show tonight, we will be going into the patron-only champagne room. We'll probably continue the conversation. I definitely want to ask you guys a question about something. I was talking to Bert Cooper today. He was pissed off, not at me, but some other things. He was venting, and I want to share a little bit of that vent with you, and I want to hear what you guys have to say. If you want to join us, there's only one way to become a patron. If you're worried about that monthly or yearly commitment, don't worry. You can join for free. That's right. Try us out for 7 whole days wherever you are watching or listening to the show. There's a link in the description. You can try us out on Patreon. Now, let's talk about Gothic capitalism. Art evicted from heaven and earth. That's dark. That is like the dream title I wish I would have come up with for a song or an album. And I hope our guest isn't pissed off if I do ever pick up a guitar again and record some more music. I'm definitely stealing that title. Today on TIR, we're joined by artist, writer, and the editor of the Locust Review, Adam Turl, whose forthcoming book from Revolve Press, Gothic Capitalism, Art Evicted from Heaven and Earth, interrogates the ruins of late capitalism through the lens of the Gothic. In this work, Turl explores how the post-industrial wastelands of the United States, born from the defeats of radical movements of the 70s, have become the haunting ground of contemporary culture. What emerges is a theory of a Gothic capitalism, a cultural formation marked by nostalgia, horror, and repetition, in which capital endlessly reproduces itself, even as it gesticulates towards its own destruction. But more than simply diagnosing the cultural logic of neoliberal decay, Turl offers a provocation. Can art allied with the working class escape the tombs of bourgeois galleries and the deadening circuits of commodification? Can it become a living force again, a beacon of collective hope rather than just a reflection of private despair? I, of course, do not have the answers to these questions, but hopefully our guest does. Please welcome Adam Turl.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and I'll try not to say anything demonetizing.
It's okay. We'll find a way to say it. You know, Adam, I tried when I first started, And then ever since they sent the first email that said I couldn't monetize something where I didn't even curse, everything is Bill O'Reilly. Fuck it, we're doing it live. So they demonetized a show where we didn't even curse. They demonetized a show that Ben Burgess was talking about philosophy. It's not like he was saying it with his dick in his hand. He was just talking about philosophy. So we did a show on the history of USAID. Sent me an email. You're not going to monetize this one. We didn't even curse that much.
Well, okay, you're escaping the discipline of the algorithm, right? Like, which is informed by capitalist ideology, right?
Yeah.
So, like,
the algorithm just says whatever these people say, just say no and make them fight us. And then
the algorithm has a personal beef.
A total beef. I felt like today, because I can only judge you off what I read, right? I've never spoken to you.
Right.
So I will say that speaking to you has calmed me down a little bit, because I told you off air I was very nervous about this conversation, because it's very serious work that you do. So I was like, I think this man's gonna be real serious. I even wore a button-up shirt because you seem so serious.
I washed my shirt.
Well, let's get into this idea of Gothic capitalism. You explain it, but it takes several pages to explain it, because it's not just something you can say in 2 words.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure I'm not the first person that asked you about it. I'm not going to be the last person that asked you about it. And it feels like a lot of your artwork that you do revolves around this idea too. Is that true? The art?
Yes. Yeah, it does. I got interested in the idea of what China Mayville called Gothic Marxism when I heard them speak at a conference in Chicago in 2013. And I started reading other people's work on this idea of the Gothic, not strictly in the sense of, like, Gothic like in pop music in the 80s or whatever, but like Gothic is this sort of being out of time type thing in classical literature and art, where there's this sense of things being anachronistic or dislodged in time. And I became interested in thinking about how in capitalism, liberalism, and also a lot of different kinds of some versions of Marxism, there's this idea that history is progress, that things are going to get better over time almost automatically. And I think what we actually see is that it goes back and forth. It isn't this automatic progress. Like, gains are won, autonomy is carved out, oppressions are beaten back here and there, and then over time those things are taken away. And we end up having this Gothic relationship to time, where the past isn't just one thing and the future isn't just one thing, but it's contested, if that makes sense.
You said in a recent interview with Revolt Press, where you're kind of asked to explain Gothic capitalism, you said, I mean, this is just part of what you said. I'm assuming the interview was a written one, or was it over the phone?
That one was written.
Yeah. Okay, I was going to say, because if that's, again, this is what made me nervous. Like, this guy talks this way normally?
No, I had the chance to edit through what I was going to say.
But anyway, he says, what is presented as novelty and innovation in capitalist ideology turns cultural forms, institutions, and individual human beings into anachronisms, into ghosts from the past. This is experienced by working class persons as a confusion of past and future. Contrast this to liberal and vulgar Marxist notions that there is a deterministic teleology of progress. In truth, the past is both strong trade unions and lynch mobs. The past is both civil rights and the Vietnam War. The past is not automatically better or worse than the present. It is both. And so is the future. We cured the old diseases that plagued humanity, and then capitalism let new plagues fester. We created technology that should make all information and knowledge free. Capitalism uses it to addict us to social media and online gambling. Unquote. So is Gothic capitalism just a mix of the ruins of resistance that capitalism has left behind? Is that part of it?
I think that's part of it, but I think it gets reproduced in lots of ways. Because one of the things I mentioned in that interview is that capitalism is not like the classical Marxist understanding of capitalism was that it was terrible, but to develop it was sort of historically necessary to develop the abundance of wealth that was needed to create a truly democratic, equal, egalitarian society of abundance. But we're well over a century past the point where that was possible. Yeah. And now that wealth, that accumulation of wealth, instead of being shared equally, threatens the very existence of human life on the planet with climate change and other crises. We even have industries that are based on the rolling back of development in various countries. So for example, some of the quote unquote recycling industries that tear apart infrastructure and melt it down into its basic components. And I think this gets experienced like we've been talking about, like as this sort of being dislodged in time. My parents' hometown, which is also my partner's hometown, made tractors from around the Civil War until 1983. And it was unionized at a certain point, and there were lots of strikes in the 40s and 50s. People started to carve out a better life for themselves. There were all sorts of problems and contradictions in that, but that factory was closed in 1983, and the town progressively became taken over by poverty, methamphetamines, and so on. My partner remembers watching when they were a little kid as the ruins of the factory were set on fire by one of the former employees there, and it rained ash down all over the town. It was a pretty large factory. It was in the middle of that town. And this kind of anachronism isn't just in terms of cultural matters or infrastructure or the places where we live, but also down to us as individual human beings. And this is praised by like Silicon Valley ideology and so on as disruption. But you constantly have people who have learned how to do something useful in life, becoming anachronistic from the point of view of capital. One of the examples I think of is rideshare apps, where basically you go through tech companies as a middle person, instead of going through taxi companies or hailing a cab. And it used to be that it cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a medallion to drive a cab in New York City. And it wasn't an easy job, but it was one that you could theoretically count on to make a decent living. And that gets destroyed by this technology that's supposed to make things better, but somehow doesn't.
I remember when that was looked at. I don't want to say necessarily leftists, maybe liberals. It doesn't matter. Okay. Sure, people will get mad at me for saying it doesn't matter. But I remember the early days of Uber when it hit where I'm from, the Bay Area. I remember people being like, "Oh, this is awesome! It's connecting people." And that was like the idea of a lot of the Silicon Valley creations, right? It was always about people connecting, which is there's like a real dark irony to this idea that through social media we're more connected, right? It kind of gets back to oh God, what is that movie from like the 30s where Charlie Chaplin has the great I can't think of the name of the movie right now. Is it not The Great Communicator? Is that what it's called?
It was the Dictator, or
is that what it's called? Where he has like that great speech at the end.
Yeah, I think so.
You know, the radio and the telephone have us more connected and we're more alone. And that's kind of how you feel about social media. Like that was the whole thing. We're going to get more connected. Even music streaming wasn't designed for us to just stream music. The original design was to be these. They used to call them storage locker services, right? I've always found that extremely interesting that technology is supposed to help bring us together and make life easier, but it feels as if a lot of these advances have atomized us and made us frighteningly lonely to the point of, I don't even want to say dystopian, because I don't know of a science fiction novel where suicides are hot. Steroid use is up, and everybody's got fake everything. Maybe Repo, the Genetic Opera, kind of has a little bit of that in it, but I can't think of anything.
Well, I think that there's a really good essay by these guys from the 1990s. Their names are Barbrook and Cameron, called "The Californian Ideology," that I mentioned in the book. And they're sort of criticizing what they saw at the time as the ideology of Silicon Valley. And they connected up to sort of Bay Area counterculture in the late 60s, early 70s, being divorced from its connections to like the new communist movement, the new left, losing its egalitarianism, but still having this sort of messianic utopianism. Mm-hmm. And originally, like, people are discussing like the possibility of the internet as sort of this agora, which is both a marketplace but also like a town hall. Mm-hmm. And then that gets displaced by the idea of the bazaar, a middle class market, versus what people called like the cathedral of higher education, the State Department, the mass media, legacy media like the New York Times, the institutions of so-called like high culture and ideology. But Barbrook and Cameron sort of locate what they argue is like one of the central ideological pillars of Silicon Valley as this ideal of a world of cyborg masters and robot slaves. And they note, for example, like offshoring of the production of the actual hardware of computers happens very early, because it not only to save money, and there was a strike in Silicon Valley amongst manufacturing workers, but also because ideologically it was incompatible with this dematerialized utopia that was supposedly being created. And they compared this, Barbrook and Cameron compared this to Thomas Jefferson's invention of the dumbwaiter, where he could be served dinner by slave labor without ever having to see necessarily the slave labor producing his dinner. It's both a restructuring of labor and a lie at the same time, because these digital machines require a massive amount of actual labor. I remember, I think it was when Amazon, opened up these fully automated, supposedly grocery stores that were supposed to be entirely digital. It turned out they had actually hired dozens of people in real time to monitor the grocery stores and do the work that the AI was supposedly doing remotely in India. And I remember my partner and I having the thought, the Mechanical Turk is made of people, and of course that's a literal case of that, but it's also true with the stolen labor from us that they use to train their AIs, or whatever they're doing with the stolen labor they've taken from previous generations of working class people.
You describe post-industrial America as haunted by the shells of the 1970s, where radical energies were extinguished. How do these ruins shape the production and reception of contemporary art today, in your opinion?
Well, I think that the art world tends to have a sort of prosaic, utilitarian attitude towards some of these ruins, partly because of the art world's role in gentrification historically. Whether artists have always been conscious of that or not, and and I'm not bringing this up to like necessarily moralize around individual artists or galleries or whatever, but there is a practical role that art plays for real estate capital in the gentrification process as it relates to some of these ruins. But I also feel like there is a tendency in a lot of contemporary art to ignore that aspect of life and human being at the same time. Like the art gallery might be in an old warehouse, but you're not going to necessarily see in that art gallery a lot dealing with the reality of what happened to the people who used to work in that warehouse or the generations that came after. Because there's a sort of avoidance in contemporary art of social class, politics more generally, but also an avoidance of drawing any generalizing conclusion from those things. So you might see political artwork at the art gallery, but it sort of tends to avoid a strong politics. I feel like
in what way? Give me an example.
Well, for example, you'll see work that touches on, particular historic injustices without weighing in on them. And that's in the political instincts, or plays with the signs of oppression without fundamentally challenging them. This leads sometimes to very conservative work. I remember there was a show in St. Louis that was ostensibly supposed to be critical of racism, but ended up recapitulating racist tropes within it. For example, images from the civil rights movement had been covered in whitening toothpaste for some reason. And
what is that supposed to mean?
Right. I was working as an art critic for a newspaper at the time, and that's pretty much what I said. And then there were images of Black women from hip hop magazines, also smeared with the same thing, which was even worse.
Is that supposed to mean that they're trying to be white? Is that what that's supposed to mean?
Well, the artist was white.
They're not with us anymore.
Well, the curator lost their job, and
Whoa.
I don't know what that artist is doing it now. That artist was having a lot of successful shows in Europe. I'm spacing their name right now, but then it did not go over well in St. Louis, and rightly so.
Was there? Can I ask you this question? Was there a lot of Black people there to see it?
There were at the meetings I went to that were critical of it, but I also know that Black staff at the museum had talked to the curator and told him that he should not do the show. And
really, damn,
the curator had been one of my professors.
Word, and the curator was like, "This art is too powerful; it has to be heard."
It was just empty playing with signs, and in this case, it was terrible because the person playing with them didn't realize what they were doing, or they did and didn't care, and I emailed the curator because I was writing the review of it for this newspaper called the West End Word in St. Louis, and said, "Hey, just so you know, I'm gonna tear your show apart, but do you want to say something?" I never heard from him again.
Oh wow! Like, what was your first instinct? Like when you see stuff like that, because you write about Emory Douglas, I'm saying the name right, in your work. So it's not like you've never seen certain aspects of like revolutionary Black art before.
No, well, this is a concern I noted in the art world in various cities, but especially in St. Louis. The default is sort of like this sort of what they called casualism or zombie formalism, or abstract art without the content of historic abstract art, like without the contextual meaning of historic abstract art. And then things that sort of play around with signs and this sort of postmodern pastiche. Usually they're not like as disastrous as that show in St. Louis was. Usually they're just kind of they're there a lot of the time. But if you don't think signs have a connection to reference, which was the philosophy of the curator, postmodernism, basically, then it wouldn't occur to you that what the signs represent might be gross, or you're racist, or anti-working class, or now that's an extreme example. Most of the time, it doesn't get that bad. Although there are other examples like The guy is Andrew Goldsworthy, I think I'm spacing his name, who was the poet in residence at the Museum of Modern Art, who didn't actually write poetry. He just collaged together official documents. And he did that with the Mike Brown Ferguson autopsy report. And then people started looking at other aspects of how this is problematic to just treat the lives of people as raw material without seriously engaging with their human subjectivity and political agency. I remember an essay that we published in Red Wedge, which I used to be an editor at the time, and criticizing this. And the title of the essay was just "People Actually Live Here," so there's that sort of play with, like, as if they don't mean, or as if you can't overcome them, overcome the injustices or inequalities and so on. But a lot of times the default is this just sort of empty formalism and this avoidance of strong images and strong politics, which is far more common, I think, in the art world than things that go sideways, like the Huslip was the curator's controversy in St. Louis.
Is the art world still a place that's kind of dominated by a certain bourgeois sensibility where, I don't know any schools that have, I know a lot of art programs got cut where I'm from. I don't know if it's the same where you're from. So the idea of even going to look at art is kind of like, it's almost like going to the fancy part of town to go look at clothes you can't afford. Like, this is Hermes and this is Louis Vuitton and Yves Saint Laurent, and that it's important because it's expensive. And art feels the same way. Like, this is a gallery that has Picasso in it, and we're going to go in here because that's what's important. Or 90s pop art, right?
I think there's good and bad aspects to the art world. I feel like on the one hand, there is a sense of like social promiscuity in the art world that there's this notion that you can mix with anybody and learn from anybody and so on. There's also this social climbing aspect to it. That's a problem where people will, and this drives me nuts, not just be polite, but be effusively praiseworthy of things they don't like because they think they might get something from another person, and things like that. It's definitely true at the very top of it. It's about financial investments and money. And I'm not necessarily saying that all the rich people who buy art are just doing it because they see it as a financial instrument and they're using it to leverage or do money laundering or whatever they're doing, although that happens. But at the top, it's about money, and that impacts what gets made, what is seen as desirable within the art world. And this sort of politics of interpersonal politeness means that certain things are not discussed out loud, even when they are obvious. The art world prides itself that anything can be art, any object, anyone can be an artist, and so on. But then there are all these multiple gatekeepers preventing that from being out of control. And I think that one of the problems in art is, on the one hand, I think it's great that we had all these modern art movements and radical critiques that allowed more and more things to be considered art and more people to be considered possible artists. And at the same time, though, when the sort of modern art ideal of art for art's sake was jettisoned, it was replaced with nothing other than utilitarian value, or a sort of like performance of the idea that the art museum or the art gallery is important without a sense of why, a lot of the time. So
why is that bad for people?
What do you mean?
Why is the why bad?
Well, I think that you have, for example, I love the St. Louis Museum of Art. There's a pretty good collection there. There's a bunch of paintings by the artist Max Beckmann, who had to flee the Nazis and then ended up teaching in St. Louis. There's also some really great work by the artist Kerry James Marshall. There was a Louise Bourgeois. Anyway, there's some great work there. But without what happens when there's a sort of rationale for the existence of an institution, you can have fights over it.
Mm-hmm.
People on the left were historically critical of the idea of art for art's sake, because that's the bourgeois ideal. You
Mm-hmm.
collect art because it's art, right?
Yeah.
And for the capitalist class and at least the first half and the early part of the second half of the 20th century, they collected this work and celebrated it in part because it was a metaphor for themselves in their minds. Like, this artist is a great genius. They did this thing that's never been done before. Just like my uncle who owns that factory or whatever. They saw themselves in this idea of individual achievement being celebrated. And when that sort of process of modern art innovation comes to a close, once anything can be considered art, if you put it into the art space and can make an argument for it, they stop defending their ideal of it. And the left criticism was, you could no longer make the left criticism of art for art's sake, but there was nothing there. And they started to like treat art spaces as attractions, which isn't necessarily good or bad. There's a book by Clara Bishop that talks about what she calls normative attention. So when people are complaining about people on their phones, they have a normative idea of what they should be paying attention to.
Yeah.
Probably they should be reading a book or staring at one painting for 5 hours or something like that. But it's also a normative idea of attention to think those things are not, those are two different capitalist ways of looking in conflict with each other. And I think what we'd like to see is a third non-capitalist way of looking, one that isn't normative, one that figures out what would be best for the spectator. And one of the points I try to make in the book is that images have sort of been liberated by digital media, as well as the history of modernism. Images have been liberated, but the spectator hasn't been liberated. The person who looks at the image hasn't been liberated. And the example I use is a middle-class tourist in Manhattan in Times Square, looking at a picture on Instagram, and then take that very same image on Instagram, and the person looking at it is a working class single mom in Detroit walking by what's left of the River Rouge factory. The image is free, but the human beings are still constrained.
Oh, that's deep. You and I were talking earlier about the idea of selling out. Where I live in Mexico, it's very tourist heavy. And the great artist Frida Kahlo I don't think anyone here knows any of her work, but her image is on everything. And it's fascinating to see these pictures of drug dealers right next to, constant images of Frida Kahlo like a cartoon, anime Frida Kahlo. The same can be said to Banksy to a certain extent, where his name, I think, means high culture in certain arenas, to the point where, even higher end black billionaires have adopted the Banksy hairdo, if you will. Jay-Z has the Banksy dreadlocks from his iconic picture with Warhol and the boxing gloves. What happens when these artists, after their passing, become capitalist fodder? Does that belittle their art at all?
I don't necessarily think so, because what happens to critical artists is the same thing that happens to critical activists, organizers, union leaders. It's something Lenin talked about, right? They defang these people after they pass on, and sort of take away the radical content of what folks did. So when they can, sometimes it's very difficult to. So they do that with a lot of like labor leaders. Historically, there's many institutes in Germany named after Rosa Luxemburg. They do that famously, of course, with Martin Luther King.
Oh yeah.
who of course died fighting for wage increases and union rights. And then, and then they take a quote from the "I Have a Dream" speech and put it on a placemat at McDonald's where somebody's not making enough to make ends meet. So I think this happens all the time. I do think that one of the things I talked about in the interview, but also in the book, is this idea of the social context and performance around an artwork. And I think one of the solutions to the rarefied art world that is this bourgeois space at the end of the day is to make work for other constituencies. The vast majority of the human race is not bourgeois. We have communities that we need to be in connection with, and we can make our art with those folks in mind and in collaboration with those folks, not just because it's the right thing to do or for some ethical reason, but I think it also makes the artwork better because there's something about making work for well-heeled people, drinking mid-shelf wine and not caring about your work, that's sort of empty, especially if that process is being used as part of gentrification or financialization. And I put in some historic examples like Picasso's Guernica, right? Like there is some references in Guernica to Spanish history and mythology, and as well as the specific events of the Nazis dropping bombs on this Spanish village. But there's not a lot of overt political stuff in the painting. But we have that painting imbued with that meaning because it was toured to raise money for the Spanish Republic and because it's been used in anti-war and anti-fascist contexts and protests since. So I think one of the things that artists have to do is think about the social context of our work and the performance of our work in the world. I mentioned the protests in Boyle Heights in that interview you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
In Los Angeles about 7 years ago, I think it was. A lot of art galleries had moved into Boyle Heights, which is a largely working class and Latino neighborhood, at least since the
was, yeah.
Yeah. And people protested these galleries, rightly seeing them as a bulwark of gentrification. And my partner and I were living in Las Vegas at the time, discussed how it's not really possible to make artwork that's anti-capitalist and be in these galleries because the gentrification becomes part of the meaning of the work you put in there. So how do we deal with the social performance of our artworks? And that's not a new thing. This is something like theorists like Walter Benjamin talked about in terms of the church, like the altarpieces, the icons, the sculptures all have a performative meaning. A social meaning as well as a spiritual or whatever meaning in their relationship to the people around them.
I wanted to ask you too about how you felt about graffiti. Is that kind of the last bastion of real art, kind of sticking on the whole selling out aspect of things, right? Because I think you and I are of a similar generation. I'm 47. Where there really was a thing that you weren't supposed to do, which was sell out because the generation prior to us sold out, right? And we couldn't be them. So there's kind of all these movies about selling out in the late 90s and 2000s. Even Office Space, right, is about selling out and nihilism. Is there something to be said about the just bare wall as the last place, a train car where quote unquote real art happens, or is that just also is that equally as pretentious as no, I'm in a gallery, so I'm serious? Well,
I mean, I think there can be good art in lots of different contexts. I absolutely love graffiti, and one of the things that there's two things that stuck out to me when I was trying to think, what would be the sort of aesthetics of like a genuine post-capitalist totality or a movement that's anti-capitalist, because it has to be made up of millions of people from all sorts of different backgrounds, identities, gender, everything. and as well as individual psychologies. And so I started thinking about what some of us are talking about is a differentiated totality, a totality that's not reductive to archetypes, but is a totality. So we're looking at things like the idea of the carnivalesque, of large groups of people with bodily chaos. And two images stuck out to me. And one where I live in a town with a lot of historic punk houses, including probably what we're told is the oldest one in the country, which is called Lost Cross. The house band at Lost Cross when I was in high school was called Diet Christ. I'm pretty sure the house band now is at Mosquito. It's right across from the Catholic Church.
Makes sense.
Anyway, the two images that came to my mind were this other punk house called Taco Stand. And it's just the wall of posters from the hundreds of shows that have been at the Taco Stand over the years. Just jumbled over each other, all these different subjectivities and aesthetic gestures and ideas and band names and political posters and things from protests, all mixed together in this jumble.
Mm-hmm.
And the other image I had in my mind was an image from the PBS documentary about graffiti writers, Style Wars. From like
yes,
an image of the inside of a New York City subway car, just completely covered in tags, early wild style, or mid-early wild style, which also has this Gothic component in some of the work as well. So like that jumbling of subjectivities and expressions, that's like in my head the dream of what what the radical communist revolutionary anarchic version of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony or the Public Enemy album Fear of a Black Planet, like that jumble, that wall of sound that was in that album.
So you're a big Public Enemy fan?
My sophomore year, the sophomore summer of high school, I only listened to Fear of a Black Planet and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It's all. I just went back and forth.
Were you the white artist that put the white out on the black people?
I don't know. Well, that Shockley wall of sound.
Yeah.
Because it's right before the end of the golden era of hip hop sound collage. After what was it? Who was it that sued Biz Markie?
I can't think of the guy's name, but I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
And after that, there wasn't the same kind of open source sound collage sort of thing. But it's just hundreds and hundreds of samples in this gorgeous wall of sound that's very, very reminded me that summer very much of the wall of sound, particularly the fourth movement of the Ninth Symphony by Beethoven. So I kept going back and forth between those two albums.
That I would have never thought to do that. That's actually quite interesting. I would love to talk to you more about hip hop when we have more time.
I didn't think to do it. I just ended up doing it because I loved punk, I loved hip hop, and I was pretentious, so I liked jazz, and it wasn't. I actually did like it, but I was a pretentious jerk.
I mean, I think the sampling persists, right? Because I think it changes as the technology changes. Because I think the sample time back then was a lot shorter. So if you go back and listen to the whole of those records, you're like, oh wow, they took that little piece and then they played it, they slowed it down. Oh, that's pretty interesting. And then you start to see as samplers got better, the time got longer. Then they could just take longer parts of records, and some of it sounded better, right? I think like listen to De La's first record, which is what you're talking about, kind of a sound collage of 15 samples on one album, and then listen to Balloon Mind State just 3 years later. It's so different because they're able to take longer parts of passages of music.
Well, I think that I like certain response. I think overall the pattern, I think to some degree, like once the samples become more expensive, the pressure is to use them more, right? To use the sample you bought more and not like pick the 30. And I love the early De La Soul albums, and Beastie Boys, Paul's Boutique, in terms of like, you know, sound collage.
Mm-hmm.
I think like you know, you get people making their own things to sample.
Portishead.
After 91, you know, like with obviously, or playing a mix of sampled and live music, like with the Roots.
Yeah. No, I thought when I first heard the Roots, we were blown away by those guys when they first came out, because I was like, dude, this sounds like a sample. But they were kind of playing in a certain style of hip hop that lent itself to sound like a sample. You know, I don't know. I'm not, now that I'm older and I have the history of recorded music in my phone, I find that sometimes I don't go back to the Roots. Surprising, because I loved them when they were out. I was all about them, you know. And as I got older, I was like, nah. And I can't tell you why. I can't put my finger on it. But I do like going back and listening to the Tribes and the Souls of Mischiefs, and, you know, all these people that kind of, like you said, layered these different intricate pieces of different kinds of music too. That's another thing. It really is throwing a lot of things at a wall and seeing what sticks, and having that be gone from the genre for just a bunch of reasons, right? Number one, that it's not cost effective. Some of it wasn't really that danceable.
Yeah. Well, yeah, some of it was, I'm really angry at the man now, but I don't want to dance. It was grand, it was grand upright music versus Bismarcky. Because I remembered I always wanted to call it Grand Uptight Records versus.
I toured with Bismarcky because I worked on a kid's TV show that he worked on and got to know him quite well. And I never brought that up. Knew about it, didn't want to bring it up.
Yeah, but he probably didn't want to talk about it.
He was way more open than you think.
Really?
Oh my God! At catering, that guy would just, because it was him and Cool V, and they would just start the funniest old man hip hop arguments. And we first started talking to him. We were probably like a week into the tour, and I was intimidated to talk to him. It was Bismarcky, and he's not a little man, or wasn't. He was like 6'6", and him and Cool V were having an argument over what was the second ever hip hop record.
Oh God!
Like physical records you could go buy. Like, what was the second? Yeah, what was the second one? Yeah. And I remember I stopped him and I said, I wish I had something to record this, because I no one would believe me if I told them. And they started laughing, and then we kind of hit it off after that. But yeah. That guy was beyond a character. Just loved hip hop, loved it. I've said it on the show before. He would watch YouTube battles in his dressing room, like of young people, because he just loved the genre. So he was a good dude. But back to you, Adam Turl. You write about a history of autonomy gained and lost repeatedly and on various levels. What role do horror and nostalgia play in the culture of Gothic capitalism? And how might artists resist the repetition of these traumas?
Well, in terms of the repetition of the traumas, I think that it's important that we don't recapitulate the horrors of capitalism in a way that acts as sort of a disciplinary. I think it's possible in some of, like, you know, the dystopian or apocalyptic narratives that exist, that at the end of the day, they act as a sort of apologetics, or people are being acclimated to things getting worse and horrible. And I think so I think that's in the work. I mean, external to the work, it'll take social movements and social forces, I think, to undo it. I think horror and nostalgia play out because of how things are fought these fights go back and forth, and until the system is overthrown, it's going to reestablish or roll back the gains of social movements. So we talked before about like the history of the past being one of, on the one hand, winning union rights, having strikes that successfully built unions that allowed people to improve their lives, having movements that beat back legal racism, that won abortion rights, that rolled back anti-gay laws, that created things like Medicaid and Medicare, as insufficient as they are. But we also constantly have those things under assault. And even on an individual level, or especially, or in addition on an individual level, somebody might carve out a life for themselves that maybe is a bit better than it was for their parents or something, only to have that torn asunder for their kids, which is a pretty common experience, I think, for a lot of working class people. My parents were the first people in either one of their families to go to college and graduate. And I had a lot of friends whose parents were in the same position. And they went to college, but they're not doing nearly as well as their parents were. Things keep getting rolled back. And I think we'll see that even more catastrophically now, given some of what's happening in Washington, D.C. So I think because, I describe it this way, because unless we completely win, they will continue reestablishing these old problems. Things become a sort of history of post-Marxisms and post-feminisms.
Yeah, you wrote about it.
Because we haven't defeated in video game terms, we haven't beat the last boss.
We haven't rescued the princess on Mario.
Or got rid of the idea of princesses and completely or whatever.
We haven't beat Mike Tyson. I don't. Thank you for talking to me. I don't want to keep you too long. It's been about an hour. I do want to ask you this. As I was reading your work, I was definitely thinking a lot about this term, and I've talked about this with a friend of mine who, literally for a living, he talks about pop culture of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. His name is Dan Larson. Has a very successful channel called Secret Galaxy. So if you ever want to check out what was the history about the capitalist history behind your favorite cartoon series as a kid, Dan has a pretty funny take on it, where he doesn't try to get very political. He does come on this show to get political when he wants to be, but we often talk, whenever him and I get together, we often talk about nostalgia. Is nostalgia an intoxicant? And if so, is it bad?
I think it depends partly on what you're nostalgic for and to what you do with it. So obviously, all right, somebody is nostalgic for the 1950s. That's probably bad.
What if they just like the greaser hair and James Dean?
Hey, if they want to do that stuff, that's cool. But generally speaking, but there's also the fact that unions were really strong. They weren't perfect, and there were many problems with them. In fact, they had been purged of communists, and they were moving to the right and were complicit in U.S. imperialism globally. Mm-hmm. However, they allowed, my grandpa not to live in poverty, yeah. People, let's say somebody's nostalgic for the 1970s. Are they nostalgic for the cocaine spoon at Studio whatever, or are they nostalgic for the sense that there's a Black Power movement that might actually achieve fundamental change? Mm-hmm. So nostalgia depends. And one of the things Mark Fisher, who wrote the book Capitalist Realism, talks about is one of the nostalgias that's out there that isn't reactionary, and depending on what you can do with it will be paralyzing or not, is the sort of nostalgia for a time when large masses of people believed in alternative futures. That capitalism doesn't have to be the way it is, that we can do better than just tinkering with this. we need to replace it with something completely different. And in fact, the absence of that idea is, I think, what's given room to the far right and these fascist types to make progress in the United States and in Europe, and depending, partially in Brazil and India. Mm-hmm. Is the absence of an idea that an alternative is possible has given all this ground to fascism and the far right. So, and they're, of course, using nostalgia. So I think it depends on what the nostalgia is for at one level. And I think a lot of the immediate reaction against nostalgia from liberals and leftists comes from, one, an understandable place of not wanting to be nostalgic for times that in their generalness were bad, particularly for certain oppressed groups, but also harkening back to this idea there's a history is progress, but history is both progress and a disaster.
Yeah.
It's not one or the other. Yeah, we make when we fight, we make progress. We beat back this horrible thing, or we carve out some space, or we fight and then people get to go to college and stuff like that. But they also take this stuff away. They erase entire sections of U.S. history from federal websites and take away funding for scientific research that deals with women, because that's one of the blacklisted, words now, which I'm not really sure how you do scientific research if you cut out
the word
51% of everyone, and that's not to discount their anti-scientific stuff on queer and trans and other folks that erases the actual complex reality of gender. So I think it depends on nostalgia for what. And then I think looking at what we've lost as well as what we've gained can help us figure out how to recreate a sense of having a future where you don't just mitigate, inequality or mitigate racism or mitigate sexism or heterosexism. But we actually get rid of it completely, like and actually become humans.
I asked that question because I recently saw a trailer for a documentary about the area I'm from, San Francisco, about gentrification, and the people that made it are younger than me, and that doesn't mean youth can't make it interesting film. I'm not saying that, but they were opining for a San Francisco that never existed literally in their lifetimes. That probably didn't exist in their parents' lifetimes. The Manhattanization of San Francisco starts in the 70s, and the people that made this were born in the 90s, talking about the city they love and miss. And I'm like, what city was that? Because technology and finance capital had been in San Francisco. The Transamerica building, I think, is built in the 70s. So what San Francisco are you missing? I asked that question because I feel like, especially when conversations around gentrification happen, it's not everybody, but I see a lot of people talking about this imagined past, like New York, Times Square is one where people go, oh, Times Square right now is like Disneyland, and New York was better when it was dirtier. It's like people died there quite a bit. Like things did get better as far as life expectancy. Is there a better way for us to look at the past?
Yeah, I think we need to have. There's two things. I think when you're dealing with culture, there's way people feel about particular signs associated with the past, like images, words, text, phrases, and things like that. And that's important because those feelings can be constructed or discussed in a way that can make good art and can help people be critical. But I think we need to look at the actual reality of what happened. The process by which New York was gentrified, right, starts in like the 1920s, New York, Manhattan.
Yeah.
Starts in the 1920s with a plan for New York where they want to systematically remove the working class from the city and get rid of like a lot of, it was kind of joked about social democracy in one city because of the extensive healthcare systems and other things that have been put in place to help the hundreds of thousands of workers, industrial workers in New York City. And that gets put on hold partly because of the Great Depression, but then after World War II, they moved the docks out. They out of the city proper. They de-zone the textile industry, which is what ultimately creates things like the art enclave of Soho and all this stuff, which gets described in the alternative weekly press in almost in colonial terms, like it's like a wilderness to be conquered by artists and hipsters and whatever they're called at the time. And of course, most of the artists who initially moved to these places are not from the suburbs; they're from other parts of the city or other cities. But it's actually a series of traumas. It's a series of shocks. The sterile, Disney-fied, and way too expensive, Times Square is not a separate universe from the rough and tumble, sleazy Times Square of yesteryear. These are like two sides of a dialectical coin in the scheme of the city's bourgeoisie to displace the working class population, right? And it's true, of course, like, health expectancy went up. Also, like, working class people are being priced out of Manhattan, and increasing, and the city as a whole is seeing declines in whole segments of the population. I think, like, the feeling that some things were better and some things were worse, those feelings are true for the person experiencing them. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't know exactly what's happening. I used to live in Chicago. I lived in Chicago for half of my adult life. I grew up here, but I lived in Chicago. And when I go back to visit my friends, many of whom are close as family, I'm always sad because it's not, quote unquote, not the city I used to live in. But the same process I described in New York happened in Chicago in a slightly different way. And what made the city affordable for me when I was young and broke and full of beans and didn't know what I was doing was the gutting of the city that it had been for working people, especially Black folks in the city before. So these things are part of an overall process. I think it's important to, like, keep that in mind while we're talking about how people feel about the stuff. Like, if somebody says to me, "I miss the way it was," well, what did you miss about it?
Yeah.
And yeah, some of that was beautiful. Do you remember the other shit?
It always feels like consumption is what's missed, or youth. Like, there was this place we used to go to, or there was this place that we used to hang out at. Like, was it like a store? Yeah. Oh, okay. You missed the mall. Like, what do you miss about this area?
There is an erosion. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
There is an erosion of, like, third spaces, spaces that aren't, like, fully liberated, but also aren't completely. There used to be, I think, and it's true in the town I live in now. There used to be more spaces that, maybe it was about money, but you only really needed a couple bucks, and you could be there for hours, or you go down to the record store and there's the guy by the counter who will talk to you for 2 hours, who knows everything about every band, and he's like teaching you for free, And I think that definitely people miss their youth, but also people, like you were saying, miss this idea of a city they never really were a part of. Like the idea, of San Francisco sort of before the fall. There's a reason why, like, the dead Kennedys hated hippies, right?
Yeah.
Like, they were the ones in charge. They made these decisions. Anyway, I think disentangling it, because as things get better and worse over time, I think it's important to, like, unpack what it is people miss about what, and then if they miss something that's terrible, like, get in a fight with them,
No, I look, I'm going back next week to speak in San Francisco, and I guarantee I'm going to walk and think I know where I'm going and get lost because there's some, landmark that I'm used to seeing that's no longer there. It definitely, every time I go back, it looks different. The people look different, but I forget to look in the mirror to see how different I look as well. So thank you, Adam. Wherever you guys are watching or listening to this show, there is a link in the description to pre-order Adam's book, because when does it actually come out?
May 2nd.
Oh, okay. Soon. I know we had to move. We've been talking about you without you. I think probably since the book proposal was signed.
Oh, you and Mike?
Me and Mike. Yeah. So to finally get you on, again, to cool my nerves about having to talk to you, like, man, this guy says all these big words in this book. I have to have my dictionary next to me. God damn it.
Well, I hope it wasn't too bad. Sorry.
No. But no, I actually thoroughly enjoyed it. I was actually, like I said, I sent you a message earlier today saying I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I'm glad that I got to talk to you. And now maybe me and Mike need to throw you in like a 3-way to our old guy chats that we have.
Well, yeah, I'm 3 years older than you, so
yeah, you can join in. He showed me. I don't know. You listen to punks. I don't know if you were a metal guy, because there was demarcating lines back in the day. He showed me some AI stuff about Metallica and Megadeth that I was just like so sad about. It just broke my heart. So if you want to join in our old man yells at clouds chants.
Well, I always had lots of respect for the metal people I knew. I'm like, that is really complicated, brilliant music to do. And then I'd be like, is there a banjo? Like, would you like to do some? Because a lot of heavy metal guys around where I'm from do bluegrass too. I'm like, why don't we go to the bluegrass half of the night? Like, but
you're from did you ever hop a train?
No, but my neighbor Craig did. He was living in Eugene during the WTO protests in 1999, and but he got on the wrong train. It went the wrong way. He got to Seattle like 3 days after the protests were.
At least he's honest about it and doesn't lie. Yeah, I was there, brother.
Oh no, he would. If anything, if he got there on time, he might have lied and said he got there late to make it funnier.
Well, Adam, thank you again for taking the time to talk with me. Again, wherever you guys are watching or listening to this show later, there is a link in the description to pre-order Adam's book. I suggest you do it. And you are supporting an independent Marxist publisher who hopefully, if I pass the editing process, will be on as well. Will be in one of the books as well. So thank you, Adam, and have a very good rest of your evening. I wasn't joking. I was nervous. About that. I think, to come up with this concept, a lot of deep thought goes into that. I make a lot of dick jokes. Thought that goes into some of these dick jokes that I'll be making later in the champagne room does not rival. But I'm being very serious. Check the book out. I think you guys are going to like it. I know a lot of artists watch This Is Revolution, and not very often do we get to talk about art from a non-art history perspective. We actually have done some pretty cool shows on art. We did a really great show with Kuba and another art history professor on socialist art and communist art during the Cold War period. And Adam was cool, and because I got this show before they even had a cover for the book. So if you've ever seen the book shows, I always put a cover of the book so you guys know it when you look for it, right? Put a link, the book cover. I didn't have a book cover for the thing yet. So I was like, well, Mike knows I'm not being disrespectful. So I put the Christian death, that wonderful image of Susie Sue and Robert Smith. Who doesn't love those two bands? Who doesn't love The Cure and Susie and the Banshees? Right? Like, if you don't dig those bands, we could be friends, but it's going to be hard. You're going to hate coming into my house because you're going to come into my house one of these days and I'm going to be dancing around scantily clad to Susie and the Banshees. Spellbound. You have to deal with it. Thank you. I want to talk to you guys about something Bert Cooper and I were talking about. Some colored people stuff. I want to talk to you guys about this in the champagne room. I also have some dating questions for you guys in the champagne room as well. I've been watching way too much balloon pop stuff. It's destroyed my brain. Thank you guys. I'll see you in the champagne room. The link is already up. If you want to join us, there's a link in the description of this show. Just click it. You're there. See you guys in a little bit. Again, check out Adam's book. There's a link in the description. It's always the first line. Don't ask where the link is. It's the first line. I don't even write what the show is about. First line, book link. Next line, something I stole from the website that describes the book. There it is. I am out.